My name is Michael Duffy. I've written a few books on the history of crime and corruption in New South Wales. But it's an honour to welcome to Sydney John Silvester from The Age here. John, I think he's Australia's longest serving crime reporter. He's won more awards than I can poke a stick at. He's done podcast series, documentaries. He's in the Australian Media Hall of Fame. And he's published dozens of books. He's a busy man, including ones on Chopper Read that became the film Chopper, and Underbelly, which became a TV series you might have heard of. So his latest book is called Naked City. It's kind of like a greatest hits collection, which I strongly recommend and which you'll be able to get him to sign after this, should you want to. Mark Morri is the crime editor of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, which means he is certainly more important than the political editor or the economics editor. Maybe the sports editor would...
Yeah, actually, we cross over a lot now. Sport and crime.
That's right, yeah. But a very important man. He's written books, videos, won awards, podcasts, and he did a multimedia series for the Telegraph called The War, about the gangland wars of the last, decade or so, which has just been phenomenally successful. Hundreds of thousands, is that setting it too low, the listeners?
Yeah, I don't know how it's gone crazy, but I think News Limited keep that secret because we didn't get any extra money, so they don't want us to try and bite them.
Hugely successful. So we're obviously going to talk about crime in Sydney and Melbourne. I'm also going to ask these two to tell us a little bit about their careers because obviously it's not a job some of us could cope with for decades. I remember Mark once told me that when he became a crime reporter at a young age, it wasn't just because he was a good reporter, but because he was a good drinker. And this was considered an essential attribute for anyone seeking information from the New South Wales Police Force. So I might ask them for some details on that. Not medical details, they probably remain a secret between Mark's liver and himself, but we'll talk about the emotional impact. Anyway, we'll get going. Can you please just join me in welcoming our guests? We might just start with a little bit of historical background, and I just want to make a proposition that I'll put to both of you to talk about in your own cities, which is that we'll be talking a lot about organised crime, and it's my observation that organised crime often grows out of prohibition to some extent, so that a society often gets the crimes that it legislates for. The big prohibition in our time, obviously illegal drugs, but I thought we might just go back a step and talk about the previous major prohibition, which I suspect certainly in New South Wales was SP bookmaking, because there are interesting differences between the two and how corruption developed. So, John, was that a big prohibition in your state too?
Absolutely. The iron law of crime is where there's a demand, there will be a supply. And a Chief Commissioner in Victoria said you can make something illegal, but you can't make it unpopular. So for every one of these laws, you're setting up a market. Right at the moment in Melbourne, we've got a war which is based on illicit tobacco, which is because the tax is so much. It's a lawful product, but if you can buy a packet of cigarettes for $15 or for $55, what are you going to do? So we've got all these little tobacconists jumping up when you can buy your cigarettes at the pub or at the supermarket. And we've had 30 arsons as there's the battle over this. So one syndicate is making $10 million a week, which meant if they floated as a company, it'd be the 37th biggest in Australia. That's tobacco. Forget about everything else. Now, you said about SP bookmaking. Well, way back in the 50s, my old man was a copper and he was at a country station in Wangaratta, and he was polishing the floorboards with an electric polisher, and he was banging it against the skirting boards to keep the superintendent, who he didn't like, who was trying to sleep, he was keeping him awake. And the phone rang, and it was a woman saying, "I'll have 10 bob on number 5, race 4. And he said, "What number are you ringing?" And she said, "Wangaratta 19. And he said, "Wangaratta." She said, "No, it's Wangaratta." He said, "It's Wangaratta 91. She hung up. The phone book was about 3 pages. He looked down, got the number. Next week he knocked them off for SP bookmaking. The superintendent goes back to Melbourne. Every police station in the state was taking protection money. So they set up a little group with a very young copper called Mick Miller, who became Chief Commissioner. And so they set up this group called the Special Duties Gaming Branch. And then that superintendent rang my old man and said, do you want to join this group? You're such a friggin' expert on SP bookmakers. So he came down and joined this mob, and they were like the untouchables. It was, really, breaking into places and hiding in roofs and all the rest. And it was a bit of a game because the SPs weren't violent people, so it was a bit of cat and mouse. What they did do was they got the code and the numbers. So there was a group that set the price for all the SP bookmakers, and then they would ring up and tell you, this is the form and this is whatever. So they got all the numbers. And my old man went to the commissioner in Victoria and said, we've got these numbers, including several hundred in Sydney. Right. Up he flies up and he meets the commissioner, and the commissioner goes, this is fantastic work, young Silvester. We will pick you up tomorrow for the raids. No one picked him up and not one phone rang because the fix was in. So it was nationwide.
Amazing stuff. And they're similar up here, but it was different to drugs, wasn't it? There was a huge social acceptance because everyone bet.
Hey, we actually, when I unlike you, I had my upbringing was with my father. He was I call him Wog Done Good. He was an Italian. He didn't gamble, didn't do much, and so I went and joined this Daily Mirror, a newspaper, copy boy and everything. And we actually at News Limited had our own SP bookie. Mate, he was making big money. He had a mansion on Lane Cove River, Lenny Hill. He did the sports results. He was a B-grade journo. He had more money than anybody else in the joint. They tried to promote him to do things. He said, don't bugger that. I'm staying here. Then the Holloways moved in, tried to take over his book. We nearly had like a shootout in the office over the SP trade for journos. And I said, I'm a bit younger than you, and thank Christ there's somebody older than me out there reporting. It really makes me feel good because I work with this young guy, and it really anyway, it's good to meet someone so much older than me. So I didn't grow up in that, I didn't see it that much, but I do remember being taken to an illegal casino in the mid-'80s and two-up games, the old two-up games. It was fantastic in some ways. And what was great is I don't think it was any mistake that Sydney was the last place in Australia to get a legal casino because the coppers and the politicians were making too much money out of the illegal casinos. You think naturally the city, the greatest city in Australia, I'm not having a go at Melbourne, I was born there and left when I was 2 because I just realised there's more opportunity up here, that this city, the gateway to Australia, is the last place to get a casino. It's because there was so much money being paid to the pollies and the cops.
Deputy Commissioner Bill Allen was the bag man and all the money from South
that's
Lottie
right,
and company. And Victoria Police illegally came over the border and followed him to prove when he was going up to pay off the politicians. And so the level of corruption here was franchised crime. It wasn't taking a bribe. Basically, the coppers were running a show, and to turn that culture around is quite remarkable, which is what's happened.
I've got some mates who are kind of retired, and there's one mate of mine, and he'll say, we're going to go to Hawaii or something, why don't you come with us? I said, mate, I wasn't a drug squad detective in the 80s in New South Wales, mate. I don't have jars in my backyard, and he openly admitted to me, he said, mate, it was everywhere. It literally was everywhere, the corruption. And I had no idea. I was really, I think I was a lot more naive. You obviously had grown up with a father in the force and probably were a lot more aware than the stupid little boy from Hornsby that came into the big city, and that's what I was. And God, I've had a great time ever since. I really have, it's fantastic.
Well, the age tapes, which were a fascinating time. So what you got, it's state police forces didn't have the power to tap telephones. So a group of New South Wales coppers and also a group of feds who got away with it, and Victorians just slightly, they started to illegally bug the phones of major criminals, and then they were really shocked because then the crooks
Did they
were
pick up many cops on that as well?
Yeah, see, they were talking to the other coppers, they were talking to judges, they were talking to politicians. And so these coppers who were doing it, they knew they couldn't put the intelligence into the system because they'd end up in serious trouble. So they used as a go-between Bob Bottom, who was the crime reporter of the day, for safekeeping. Now, through another channel, I got hold of one. This is before the age tapes. So I was given it on the basis it was intelligence and you couldn't use it.
What year was that? Because I do remember being
80,
yeah.
83, somewhere about there.
I remember being in awe of it and people at News Limited blowing up because we were getting absolute living shit beaten out of us by the Herald and the Age because they just kept breaking all these stories.
Well,
there.
before that, I did one story, and that was that the drug dealer of the day, Bob Trimboli, was tipped off by a New South Wales copper, and I had the transcripts. But I didn't use his name. I'm too smart for that. I used a nickname. It was his real nickname, so that didn't work at all. It was his real nickname. So everybody...
It's like saying, "No, I'm not going to say Roger Rogers. I'm going to say the Dodger."
Exactly.
That would have covered it.
So
Well.
New South Wales, the Commissioner made a statement that I had a pathological hatred of everything New South Wales. The Minister made a statement. That didn't worry me at all, but I got a phone call, and it was from the Director of the Australian Bureau of Criminal Intelligence, and he said, "I know who you're talking about, he will kill you stone dead." That happened to be my father, so I took that pretty seriously. The Stewart Royal Commission then demanded I come up and give evidence, so I'm absolutely terrified. I think Roger Rogerson's going to be a baggage handler, and so I give the secret address and hop in the cab, and we drive about 3 kilometres, and he just slows up, pulls up, and says, "Wait by that pole over there." So I grabbed him in a headlock and wouldn't let him go, which sort of surprised him because he just had dodgy brakes and he was trying to call me another cab.
Can I just raise another point with both of you to see if it applies to both cities? And obviously there were similarities. We're talking about a lot of differences between our two great states. Similarities, and this is a phenomenon known as noble cause corruption, which I think just confuses the picture. What noble cause corruption is, basically, it says that before police had modern techniques like DNA, CCTV, phone taps, it was actually often quite hard to get a conviction. You'd know who did it because a trusted informer would tell you, but that informer couldn't be brought to court, obviously. So how did you convict this crook? Well, you loaded him up. Even if you're an honest cop, you wanted to lock someone up. I think that was quite common, and it often led people through that into, real corruption. Do you reckon there's some truth in that?
I used to be an advocate, noble cause corruption. You could say a means to an end, and I thought, I remember very briefly, there was a guy who was an addict going around robbing people around King's Cross, pushing a knife, grabbing stuff. The last bloke he stabbed and killed, and I wrote this great story. I was doing Midnight to Dawn, and so for the first edition it had my byline. By the second edition it had Jack Darmody's byline because he'd rewritten my story. But the coppers found him within 2 days, and found out it's because they knew where this guy was going to score his heroin, because they were called the shooting galleries. And the coppers, because they were getting backhanders to let these people operate, they knew every drug dealer everywhere, and they just went around and said, "This guy turns up, you give him up or we shut you down." Nowadays, that wouldn't happen. And I used to think, oh, what a great example of, they got a little bit of money here and there. But those little guys, that just starts, and then you end up with a Rogerson, You end up with a guy that thinks, I can kill a bad guy because who cares? Lanfranchi had shot at a cop, I'll take him out, whatever. So, I do think I've now changed my view a little bit.
Yeah, a bit of a slippery slope, isn't it?
And equally, having done this for 1,000 years, I've had cases now where absolutely good detectives have told me it's the brother, it's the next door neighbour, it's the boyfriend, absolutely, but we can't prove it. And then DNA's come along and, hey, it wasn't them. It wasn't. So how many people were loaded up who didn't do it? Now, there was one case of a bloke who was taking a contract, and he was really good at anti-surveillance, and it was a long time ago, and they knew he was going to kill someone, and they couldn't stop him. So they gave him a handgun and said, "This is yours," and he got 12 months. Now, it saved a life. But it is absolutely wrong. Funnily enough, the big Sydney crook of the early 70s, Stan the Man Smith, he wanted
Found God.
He wanted to move into Melbourne. He got as far as the airport, where there was a couple of coppers waiting, and in this pocket here, it was amazing, Mark, but they found a matchbox full of hashish. Now, how they knew to look in the top pocket. He yelled, "It's a fit, it's a fit," which was a tailor-made jacket. He was referring to the fit. It was a fit jacket. He got 12 months.
Yeah.
And he came back, and they said, "You going back to Melbourne?" He said, "No, the cops run red hot there."
Well, I'll tell you how good our guys were. There was a guy called Frank Hakim, you do remember, and he got found with half a kilo of heroin or something. But on tape, I think Current Affair got it, there was a copper called Tony Lauer, basically fitting this guy up. He went on to become police commissioner. Yeah. And that's how, but he was just doing his job, getting, it was... that was noble cause corruption. The guy could then go on to become the commissioner, who is caught on TV loading somebody up and still gets promoted.
Well, the St Kilda police station, the ceiling...
It's not a competition, but our guys are a lot better than yours.
They were. There's no question about
Well,
it.
you start your book off with Roger, don't you? Great book.
It's in the St Kilda police station, the ceiling collapsed and all these firearms fell out that were there for the load. But you're right. And at one point, it's probably true that New South Wales detectives were better trained, and they were certainly more corrupt. And the Victorian coppers were more gun happy. So there was a joint operation on the border, and there's a bit of tension there. And a senior New South Wales copper, to break the tension, got everyone together and said, "Come on, let's make an agreement. We won't steal anything if you don't shoot anyone."
Just one very funny story. When you're talking about corruption, the guys were ready. I think it was going to be Ian Saxton, a big drug dealer. Anyway, they had them all there on the briefing before they were ready to raid. And the head of the operations going, "We're going to go in there." And one guy up the back goes, "Sir," he goes, "Yeah." He said, "There's going to be a lot of money, a lot of cash when we go in." He goes, "Yeah." He said, "I think for integrity purposes, we now declare how much cash we have on us. I've got 200,000. And it was just the way it went back then, So, and it was a lot of fun. As I said, the police force is a lot more honest now, but God, it's boring.
During the Royal Commission, a Victorian copper was up here being out on the drink with his New South Wales colleagues, and all the drinks are arriving, and he's terrified, of course, that it's being filmed. So it was a long time ago, so he bought a round of drinks and put 20 on the bar, and the drinks came back with change for 100.
Fair enough. Okay, so the TABs came in Sydney and Melbourne in the early 60s, and eventually, they were in competition with the SP bookies and eventually wiped them out, although it took a long time, maybe 20 years or something.
Yeah.
But fortunately, another prohibition came along. A lot of young people suddenly became quite keen on drugs, various illegal drugs, I want to ask you both the same question. Did that move from SP bookmaking to drugs have any effect on corruption or policing in Victoria? Because obviously SP bookmaking had a huge amount of popular support because a huge number of people gambled. Drugs is a bit different, isn't it?
Too, isn't it? It's a victimless so-called.
So was there a change in corruption in policing because of that?
Corruption in the SP is indefensible, but you can understand how a copper turns around and says, "Well, we'll control it, there won't be any violence, we're just providing a product," and also we can... What SPs would do, which is not done, is they'd say to, the father in the pub who was betting, they knew he worked at General Motors, they knew he earned 15 quid a week, and when he starts betting 10 quid, he'd say, "Slow up.
Yeah.
You've got to slow up or I'll ban you."
Yeah.
So they were actually far more paternalistic than it was now.
There was a moral code almost, wasn't there?
The original, because of Mick Miller's group, there was the Royal Commission into off-course betting and into corruption in the Postmaster General, because they could have, when people were on a waiting list for a phone, of course there'd be 100 phones in a room.
Yeah, that's it.
So they were getting paid off. But the original agreement for off-course betting was the TAB, there were to be no seats, there was to be no broadcast, and there was to be no tea and coffee, and there was to be no same-day payout. Now think of it now, where you're just getting smashed with ads that life's going to be so much better if you bet with this group or that group or the other.
But funnily enough, it's actually the control now has led to the WhatsApp SP bookie, which is unbelievable, I found out. And it's only a recent thing. Because they now want their gamblers, they have to have so much paperwork now because there's so many oversights. There are guys, well-known guys in the criminal world, that are taking bets in a WhatsApp group and laying it off. And it's literally just the SP is back because they don't want to see all this illegal money. They can't have these transactions being tracked everywhere. With Betfair, they've suspended like enormous amounts of accounts. So it's funny again. The more we control something, the less control we have. Exactly. You know, which is but then we get back to the heroin trade and what that did to Sydney. It moved criminality to the next level. And the corruption, because again, it was the money. It's like what we're seeing now. The money they're making out of cocaine now is unbelievable. The money they were making out of heroin, again, was money. Neddy Smith, you know, I think he was enormous amounts of money. And everyone just started turning a blind eye, and they were able to pay more and more. It was pretty frightening.
Again, showing you how naive Melbourne was. A high-profile couple moved up here, and they're at the private school, and the wife's introduced, and they say, well, that's great, you're part of the gang. Friday after school, it's pizza and Coke, and she turned up with a bottle of Coca-Cola, and everyone pissed themselves laughing, going, you must be from Melbourne. But we pay the highest for all drugs. We have a history of drug use that goes right back. I wrote a story which related to a buy-bust, and some police dressed as soldiers, and they went to some chemists in the city and in Collingwood, and they asked for snow, and they were given cocaine. So it's a pretty modern sort of investigation. It happened in 1919, and it was actually because soldiers came back from World War One having used cocaine.
I was talking to a very old cop. He lived to about 94, only died recently, but they didn't know anything about marijuana. So he had to import from the FBI some marijuana plants to grow down at the botanical gardens so they could study marijuana. And he's got this great photo of him in about, 1955 or something, walking through these huge marijuana plants in the botanical garden. So the first crop in New South Wales was grown by the cops. That just shows you.
Exactly.
And we haven't looked back.
John, how did you become a crime reporter, and why have you stuck at it for so long, and has it affected you, do you think? I mean, it's not something everyone could do.
Well, I'm 27 years old, so I don't think it's had an effect at all. I was doing a double degree in sleeping in and drinking beer, and a woman asked, a friend of the family, said, what are you going to do with yourself? And I said, no idea. And this was Beverly Miller, whose husband became Chief Commissioner, and she said with a lovely smile, you should be a journalist because you've got an opinion on everything, which means, of course, you're a smart ass. So I thought, I'll put in for that because I won't get it, and then I can go back to my double love. And I fluked the job, and I wasn't any good at it, to be honest. And I went to police rounds, and you'd be the same. We had an office up at Russell Street, and it just stayed open all the time. You could drink beer and drive a car really fast, and it was cops and robbers. And I thought, hey, this suits me pretty well. And I know you'll agree, it's the purest form of journalism.
It's the most honest in a really bizarre way. Crime reporting is the most honest reporting.
Because we're the last bastion where it's not, more and more it's controlled by, media handlers, but there's still the rarity and the rawness, and, you see incredible tragedy, but you see great heroism, and you see brilliant investigations, and you see bad cops and good cops. It's the best seat in the house.
Yeah, but my story's not quite like yours. When I was working in a shipping company, which was boring me to shit, and I saw an ad for a copy boy. Thought this sounds like a bit of fun. My father said, "What are you doing, leaving the security of a shipping company for that media?" Anyway, went and did it. Walked in the joint, just loved it straight away. Got a cadetship on the Australian, which is bizarre. Anyway, I ended up on the Daily Mirror, and they were supposed to rotate me back to the Australian. They didn't want me back, and I think the Mirror got stuck with me. And anyway, through some tragic circumstances, like one of our crime reporters drank himself to death at 34. That would happen. Another one left, and I got called in. They knew, and they said, "Mate, you're okay." They'd seen me down the Evening Star, and I'd obviously liked to drink. And so Kyle Allen said, "Mate, we want to make you a crime reporter. And, mate, if you're not claiming $100 a week drinking, you're not doing your job." Now, that would be a work and occupational safety hazard now. And Dad said, that was a serious, I'll never forget. I wish I got it in writing because I'd sue the shit out of it. That was just it then. You just drank. I mean, you'd wake up under the homicide desk, and it was crazy. And I loved it, and I got to love. Back then, I didn't spend very much time with the crooks. I've actually got more contact with the crooks now than I did way back then. But yeah, that's how I started doing crime, was because I could drink.
Why have you got more contact now? That's an interesting thing.
I knew a few back there. But basically because most of my crooked contacts then were cops, so I just didn't know it. The Royal Commission came and wiped my contact book out. But now I've got what I call cyber contacts. So I've got all these. I've got a few I go and meet and have coffee. They're peripheral guys that run the edges and around with the gangster crew. And I got to meet a few of them. But I have got a couple of guys who just email me, or I had to get things downloaded by my son, Thema, and all that other stuff. And these guys have contacted me because they want to inject themselves into the narrative. And they're telling me stuff, and it all checks out. I knew about a major crook. Well, I knew about two things before the cops did. Mark Buddle, most wanted man in Australia. I knew he'd been arrested in Cyprus before the feds. I've rung them up, and they're going, "What?" Rung this, "What?" And that came from a crook who I have never met. I don't know. I think he was somewhere over there. So that's it. And I still drink with the cops now.
That's
they don't,
awesome.
And Mark,
That's right.
Mark, it's longevity. They know your name,
There's
and
a bit of that.
as you said, they inject themselves into the narrative. Andy Rule and I, we did a book called Tough 101 Gangsters, and we actually had an index with their names and the page numbers, and people thought we were trying to be serious. But we knew they'd flick to the back, see their name, and buy or steal 10 copies.
That's right.
And that paid for the print run.
But there are some who like their name in there, and I've found a few that don't. The hard way, So,
John, has your job ever put you in danger?
Oh, there's been a few threats along the way. Most of them have ended up dead, so that's good. I came home and there was a shovel inside the house, and I asked my daughter, and she said, somebody just delivered it. So I went out into the front yard and started digging, just in case anyone's watching. And probably it was getting delivered to the next door neighbour by Bunnings, and they were wondering why I stole their shovel. But I always relate this to the fact that there are young men and women in the police force who tonight will be pulling over a car where there'll be guns in it, or we'll be dealing with some distressed and dangerous people, and there'll be coppers will get punched, and there'll be coppers will see things that they can't unsee. So, really, I'm in the bleachers when it comes to that.
What about yourself, Mark?
Apart from the liver, that was amazing. That it's still okay. When I keep thinking when I come back from the doctor, I go, who's the poor bugger that got mine? He's there drawing up his bucket list. But no, I've had a few, and one more recently when we were making The War, and we were shooting it kind of on the run, and they'd film us, and it was in conference, and I made a joke about there was a bikie that he was blind 20% one eye, got shot in the other later, and he's now legally blind. I said that's the only legal thing he's ever done, and some of his mates took offence, and the police called me and said, mate, there's been a credible threat. They know you live at Bondi. You and Josh, who's my partner, no, he's not my partner. Don't get me wrong. Not there's anything wrong with that, but they said there's a credible threat, and we've got to inform your bosses. Blah blah blah. We get rung up on Sunday night, say you've got to move, and I've told this story a few times. But so the managing editor rings up and says you've got to go. There's been a threat, and the copper. I rang the copper. He said, yeah, it is kind of. So they said, we can put you in the Meriton Apartments at Bondi Junction. No room service. I don't think that's not very good. So they rang up. What about the Intercontinental Double Bay? I said, now you're talking. That's okay. And young Josh, I said to Josh, now you're young, you've got to remember, this is on Rupert. This is expenses. Don't hold back. 3 days later, the managing editor rings up and goes, mate, who's been ordering the moe every night? I said, well, it ain't me. I don't have the 23-year-old girlfriend. So, yeah, and that was one. And I did have another one, which I didn't know was a threat. Very quickly, coppers rang up and said, we've got this guy, Eric the Wolf. They'd been after him. He said, mate, they knew he was behind 6 murders. They said, we've actually got him on child pornography. I went, wow. We did this huge front page. Eric, the loneliest wolf, because Eric only... Now, he was actually kissing his kid. Anyway, it was a bit of a stitch-up. And then I get a phone call, mate, we didn't think he'd make bail. And he had an ankle bracelet, one for each state, New South Wales and Queensland. And he still got bail. And they said, but it's okay, we've got eyes on him. But if you see anything, then I went, okay. I didn't think anything of it. About 18 months later, a very reliable guy I know, is a bit of moves in those very dubious circles. He said, mate, he was so fucking angry. He said he'd red flagged you, and I went, what, a communist? He said, no, mate, he'd red flagged you. And this is a guy that I know would spend $500,000 getting a guy not for looking at his ex-girlfriend. And what worried me about that one is that I never knew about it. And I knew he was behind 6. So, yeah. But I'm like you. I think they've got more important, people to kill, like their mates.
Also, a lot of them don't mind being in the papers, do they?
Sorry?
A lot of them don't mind being in the papers.
No.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And any of the smart ones just realise the political heat that would come from. I mean, the killing of Donald Mackay was probably the stupidest thing ever done by organised crime, because you can track 3 royal commissions in a raft of police powers that came from it.
Maybe they should teach that to young gangsters at school.
That it's bad.
Yeah, and name Robert Trimboli, a little bit of history here,
Well, Lenny McPherson said bodies in the street are bad for business. So,
yeah,
there you go. He knew. Yeah, let's talk about that period. Donald Mackay was killed in 1977 down in Griffith. Warrenland Franchi, 1981, by Roger Rogerson. Mick Drury was shot, not killed luckily, in 1984. Can I ask you, John, to reflect on those differences between Sydney and Melbourne? What did the Victorians think of New South Wales police back then?
Well, the prime example was with the Mackay matter, is that many years later, Victoria Police worked out that in fact the conspiracy, the planning, was done in Melbourne. So they set up an operation called Operation Trio, because they had an informer, Gianfranco Tizzoni, who had been coming down from New South Wales with a large amount of cannabis. And he was supposed to be going to Sydney, but he turned down here, and when he was grabbed, they rolled him. And so the investigation up here was being done by Joe Parrington, who was honest, and spectacularly egotistical. And so he...
The hat, didn't they call it? Yeah, the hat.
Yeah, so he, a big tall man, he came to Victoria to be briefed by the trio detectives, and he walked in and the detective started to talk, and he put his hand up and he said, I don't talk to the monkeys, I talk to the organ grinder. So he demanded to see the boss, and it later turned out that Parrington, and it was proved, concealed information from the Victorians, believing that the Victorian case would fall over. He'd swoop in, grab them, take them to New South Wales and charge them with the actual murder. So that's the sort of level of cooperation that there was. Mick Drury came to Melbourne, and the whole thing began, and there was a lot of hostility there. New South Wales coppers were more bent, but probably more proficient, and it was from memory, a $200,000 sort of buy-bust situation. Took a lot to get the Victorians to put the money up, and the Victorian police, at the moment of arrest, one of the cars came in too fast, which left a gap which allowed the criminal Alan Williams to escape. If he'd been grabbed there, it's all over. He's caught with the money. He would have been caught with the drugs. That's it. Anyway, he got away. So Mick's evidence was absolutely pivotal, and the Victorian crook, through Christopher Dale Flannery, went to Roger Rogerson. A bribe offer was made to Drury. Now think of that. Roger calls Mick Drury to his office in a police station.
I think it was Darlow, wasn't it?
Yeah, and offers the money.
Yeah.
So that's how much the fix was in. And when he wouldn't take it, they attempted to kill him. A serving member of the New South Wales Police Department is involved in trying to kill another serving member.
Yeah, vividly, Mick Drury came to my wedding, and it was a little bit of a dilemma. And Mick, I was drinking a lot with Roger. As again, I'm really going to sound like a naive, stupid idiot. I'm going to wonder how I'm sitting up here next to a guy like him, because I really did think by this stage Roger was just a dirty Harry, blah blah blah. And Mick Drury knew that I drank with Roger, and I was getting married very late in life. And I thank God Roger got locked up, because I was going to have a real problem with the wedding invitations, where to sit them, because it wouldn't have looked real well, because, you know, Rogerson but that nexus between, again, Melbourne, you know, Flannery was a Victorian who came up here to try and take over Sydney. Well, he came up here to be a hitman in Sydney, and then got quite too big for his boots, and that's when, you know, Rogerson, I think, organised getting him hit. But, you know, the story is that Roger was there when they shot poor Mick Drury, you know, and to this day, Mick Drury still believes that Roger was driving the car, and he talks about it, you know. Luckily, you know, Roger's locked up and is going to die a very slow death in prison, because he's not, you know.
We'll probably stop for questions in about 10 minutes, so anyone watching on Zoom, if you'd like to put in a final question, please do so using your chat function. So the big question, John, how corrupt were Victorians compared with New South Wales Police? We had a Royal Commission, obviously, in the mid-90s. Did Victoria need one?
Victoria had several Royal Commissions in the 70s, which probably changed things, and when there was a vacancy for Chief Commissioner, the Premier said, I'm sick of this. I need somebody who's going to run the bloody place. So they picked Mick Mellor, who was scrupulously honest. The simple difference between there was corruption in Victoria, of course there was, but the difference was in Victoria, you had to actively conceal you were a crook. In New South Wales, you had to actively conceal if you were honest, because you weren't trusted in the crime department.
I've heard that so many times, you know, and that it was so open here, and just ridiculous, you know. And as I said, I didn't understand. I just thought you drank for free when you went out with policemen. Again, I'd be there sitting with the King's Cross coppers, and I'd go down to the Bourbon and Beef, and I'd be midnight, and I said, "Oh mate, if anything happens, I've got to be near the radio car." We had radio. He said, "Mate, we'll know. Don't worry about it. You know, it'll be fine." And then when the Royal Commission came, I remember I'd just come back from holidays, and I had to identify all the 12 photos for the names, and I knew every one of them. And I had no idea. I really didn't. They were very, very. It was just accepted, you know. You ate for free. I just thought that's what they did.
In Victoria, you know, there was Ray Chuck, who was behind the bookie robbery, and he and two of his colleagues killed Les Kane, and they were a pretty famous standover family. And Ray Chuck was in custody, going to the magistrates' court. He was in the magistrates' building, facing an armed robbery charge, when a bloke stood up and said, "Cop this," and shot him. And it was a absolute rat's run to get through that magistrates' court and out the back through the magistrates' car park to RMIT. The fence had been peeled back, and really good sources say that on the Sunday before the murder, the hitman, who was Brian Kane, Les Kane's brother, had been brought in by a group of police and shown the way through. And a group of police who probably would have been there at the time were sent on a job that didn't exist. And I was told that a group of police decided, look, there's going to be a war, and the only way to fix this is to get rid of one or the other, and we'll side with the Canes.
Mark, New South Wales Police seem to have been closer to their colleagues in Queensland, weren't they? Brisbane, and also New South Wales crooks too, probably, I think.
Yeah, I don't know. I know, again, you know, we keep saying Rogerson used to go up there a fair bit. I think I didn't see a lot of that. I know that there's the Gold Coast, which a lot of New South Wales cops have all the guys that got busted in the Royal Commission, most of them got out with their pension. They all retired up there. So I mean, I didn't see a lot of it. You know, saw a little bit with Melbourne. I was stunned to find out that Roger knew Dennis Allen, like a major heroin dealer in 1980. You know, and actually got charged, and it just vanished. You can't find any records. So yeah, I think New South Wales cops they didn't care who they were corrupt with. You know, they went with the flow. So.
John, the Underbelly series and the gang wars in Melbourne from, I think, 1998 to 2010, 36 deaths. I mean, what was that all about? I mean, this is a very Melbourne thing, isn't it? We can't talk about Melbourne crime without this.
The Moran brothers, Mark and Jason, wanted to meet with Carl Williams. There was a series of disputes. There was a conflict over $400,000. They weren't happy that Carl had married Roberta, because Roberta was the former girlfriend of one of the Moran's friends. There was a dispute over a pill press, and also Carl had done them a drug run and hadn't used enough binding material, so the pills were falling apart. And it was a little park, and the rule was no guns. But for the Morans, it was more a guideline than a rule. So Jason produced a little 22 and shot Carl in the guts. And it was his 29th birthday.
So rude. What a present.
And he walked home around the corner, and his mother was baking him a cake and said, "Do you want some cake?" And he said, "No. I lost my appetite," because he had a bullet in his belly. So he went to hospital and refused to make a statement. But what happened was that Mark Moran didn't know Jason was going to do it. And one of the neighbours heard him say, "Well, you better shoot him in the head and finish the job." And Jason said, "Well, how are we going to get our money back?" And so Carl had that in the back of his mind and thought, well, they'll come for me again, so I've got to kill them. And then he just started killing everyone connected with the Morans, including Lewis Moran and all the others.
So it's more about those individuals that just happen to be involved and come into conflict. That's why you suddenly have this explosion of violence.
Which, of course, is what's happening in Sydney now. And it'll be the same result, which is
I'm not trying to brag again, but I mean, we got about 22 in about 18 months. But
very, very
it took
quick.
you a long time to
get up to those numbers.
Yeah, no, it's frightening, isn't it? It's how one little episode can just escalate. And, but the cast of characters there, well, the cast of characters are so well known because of the guy sitting over there. He created Underbelly, which it was fantastic. But it really, do you worry, I shouldn't be asking questions, but do you worry that actually almost elevated some of those gangsters into, and Underbelly, let's face it, it is, I'm hoping for an Underbelly out of this. Cause,
yeah, it's interesting, Mark. I would say if I watched that, the sort of the main copper, he was dashing, had a great girlfriend, drove a sports car. If I was a young fella, I'd be going, I'd like to be that, rather than the bloke who gets shot in the guts.
Did they write out a journalist part out? Did they write you out of the Underbelly?
I don't think anyone's interested. There was talk of it being narrated by that sort of character, but I think they did far better that way. But you're going through exactly the same thing, and the results will be exactly the same, which is more police powers, a crackdown, and as you said before, it's just terrible for business. Tony Mockbell, the big drug dealer, had a meeting with police, and he said, look, what about if I get a couple of people to put their hands up for some murders, then we all go back to doing what we do best. I'll sell drugs, you do whatever you do, and let's forget about the rest.
John, weren't you offered a cameo role in Underbelly and you were thrown off the set for overacting? Is that right?
I was there, and I was going really well, and then
if you don't say so yourself.
And then it was regarding Lorimer, which was the murder of 2 police. Anyway, the bloke who played the Chief Commissioner came out in what was the press conference, and he said, I want to announce that Strike Force Lorimer has made 2 arrests, and I'm an extra, and I yelled, cut, 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 cut. And I walked up to, where this bloke was, and I put my arm around him, and I said, mate, it's Task Force. In Melbourne, it's Task Force. He said, I'm reading the line as written. I said, don't make a fool of yourself. It's Task Force. And then I went back and I went, and action. And then the bloke playing Paul Sheridan, who was the head of the Task Force, he said, Mr. Silvester, what would Mr. Sheridan be thinking now? I said, well, Mr. Sheridan wanted to be at the arrest, but he's got to be here. So he's triumphant but conflicted. Can you give me that? And at that point, the director came over and said, don't you need to go back to work?
Okay, one last question for you, Mark, then we might open up for questions. So please think if you've got any questions in the audience. So as John sort of alluded to, the war is kind of like, it's like what happened in Victoria back then in the 90s, isn't it? It's happening here now and you're covering it, and it's huge. Is it the same sort of tight thing with families, or do you want to just give us a précis of what's been going on?
Look, it started that way. It depends. There's a rumour that it started over missing 400 kilos of cocaine that was stolen, and there's that led to the shooting of a particular individual in the Hamsey family, and then it just kind of got out of control. And it's not so much. Then there was the Alameddines, and they were fighting over drug runs, but then there were people just using it for cover. And I don't know if that happened in Melbourne, but there'd be people thinking, if I don't like that guy, if I kill him, they're going to think an Alameddine did it, and then that Alameddine thing, and then they go and knock another Hamsey, although there's 4 Hamseys dead and no Alameddines. But it's now emerged, there are some people in New South Wales Police Force, very, very high up, who believe the 400 kilos of coke that supposedly was stolen. I know there were guys being kidnapped and kneecapped trying to find this coke, never made it off the dock, and the Fed seized it and didn't tell anyone. And that has led to 22 bodies in Sydney streets. The Feds say it's wrong, and I have trouble believing it, but there's some very serious people. But again, it just takes off. Ego then takes off, and there were all sorts of, so it's not as clear cut as, the McCoys and the Hatfields, which is what we thought.
Extraordinary story. Is it over yet?
It's not over, not over by a long way. And then, as I said, they all merge. The Ahmeds, they were involved in the war with the Elmies, and about 4 years beforehand, there was a few of them getting out, and it's just, as I said, I'm learning more and more about Sydney crime every day, and I'm 62. So, yeah.
Well, and the thing is, we started this discussion by saying how separate Sydney to Melbourne crime, but that's all changed. It's all international now, the ANOM app, and we've just had a Sydney guy picked up for
Melbourne murder.
For a Melbourne murder, and there'll be more of those.
And a lot of bikies and moving to Melbourne because our cops have very, very heavy laws. You know, the consorting law, we've got Raptor, who make life hell. I mean, they picked up a guy yesterday, and it didn't work very well. For breaching his serious crime prevention orders because he used a false name to order his Uber Eats, right? And he used his nickname, which he's been using before, and you know, he got out about 6 hours later, but they're just going, hey, mate, we're watching you. And they do that. And they've made some arrests that people would say, how embarrassing, they got that guy out. And I think they wear that to just say, we're just going to harass them. For guys for putting their elbow out, they're pulling them over. So they're going, this isn't worth it. So they go down to Melbourne and put up with the weather and AFL.
And
you know,
and as a response, the government's going to bring in almost mirror laws. We had anti-association laws that.
So everyone's going to go to Canberra, where there's no non-consorting laws. You can walk around with 1.5 grams of coke, bit of heroin. You can have a great time down there. So I think we'll have to move down there to cover crime.
All right, thanks very much. It's been hugely interesting. Yeah, please put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, and we shall get a microphone to you, please, before you speak. Got one down the back and one up the front. We'll do those first two. Hi.
Sorry. John, I just wanted to ask your thoughts on the whole Lawyer X travesty.
That's Nicola Gobbo. Nicola Gobbo, fascinating character. The first thing to note is that she first came to police notice when she was a student, and she was found with a substantial amount of drugs, gave up her boyfriend, and pleaded with the court for for a conviction not recorded. And throughout her whole career, she ran too close to the crooks, and yet no one within the legal fraternity did anything about it, even though they knew they would take her for dinners or lunches and try and guide her, but no one ever said, you're on notice. For the police, they saw her not as a criminal barrister, but a barrister who was a criminal, and they used her in that regard. Where it morphed over was when she started to give confidential information. So she was doing coke with them, so she could say what they did then, but not perhaps in the interview room. And she was asking people to plead guilty and so on. So she went to the other side. They would have got away with it, except the Chief Commissioner, Simon Overland, was desperate to solve the Hodson murders, which were a witness in a case, no doubt killed on the orders of a corrupt copper. And in doing so, they turned her from a secret informer to a witness. I'm not saying what they did was right, but they would have got away with it. The inquiry was interesting because a number of police were named, such as allegations of having consensual sex when it was denied, but they were still named. Not one lawyer was named in the inquiry, including when a respected member of Pirana made an affidavit to say a particular lawyer was laundering money at the Jupiter Casino for Tony Mockbell. That name was suppressed. When Gobbo said that she began informing because the legal firm she worked for was laundering money for major drug syndicates, the name of the firm was suppressed. So I don't think it was an equal playing field. I don't think that there have been two cases where the convictions have been quashed. There's a raft of others being looked at. I don't think there's going to be a great deal of success here. Someone like Tony Mockbell wants his case relooked at. Interesting gamble, because the judge at the time said, only because you pleaded guilty did I not give you life, no minimum. So if he did get a retrial, it's a big gamble.
Okay, one up the front here, please.
Sorry, did you have a question?
That was the one question we didn't get to, so thank you very much for asking it. Yep. Anyone else like to ask? Yep.
Hi there. Out of your career, what is that one story you guys wrote that you'll never forget about it, whether it's because it shocked you or surprised you? What is that, one story?
What's this, like their most memorable day on the job? Okay.
Mine is the Anita Cobby murder. It's fun. I literally just did a podcast on it, and I actually started crying. So that is the case. It was the murder of a nurse, brutally just grabbed off the streets. It was one of my first very, very big stories. She was grabbed by 5 blokes, raped, just brutalised, and her throat slit. And I got very, very close eventually to John, her husband, who'd just split up. And I did a story then and just after the court case. And he changed his name. Within months was a heroin addict, like just terrible. So yeah, that story. And then we actually became friends. And I never gave up his name for 30 years because he changed it. And then after 30 years, he said, "No one's speaking for Anita anymore." There's these. He got very angry about people having memorials for her. And Anita's parents were dead. He said, "I want to do the book." So I did that, and in the course of the book, I got to see the photos of Anita, and that still sticks with me. And and John, halfway through the book, changed his name back to Cobby. Sorry, but it was quite amazing that he got his identity back, but it took him 30 years.
I am so happy to hear your voice quaver because that creeps up on me. Sometimes I'm talking like this, and all of a sudden you're going, "Whoa, where's that come from?"
Yeah.
So. For me, as much because it's current, is the Frankston serial killer, Paul Charles Denyer, because the police officer who cracked the case is a personal friend, and he always struck when it rained, and I'm on the periphery. I'm not the investigator, but I can hear the rain on the roof on those Fridays and thinking, will it happen? Will it happen? And the third one, Natalie Russell, the sense of hopelessness. And then at 3 a.m, you would too, I got a phone call from someone who didn't need to give their name and said, "We got him." And when you go to that case, the things that stick with you are the first victim, Elizabeth Stevens. She just had such a really unfair life. Her parents broke up. She ended up being shoved around the country, and she ended up in care. And she pulled herself up by her bootstraps, and she was doing VCE, living at her uncle's place, and she'd been studying, and she wanted to join the army. And Denyer walked, as she was walking home, she was on the home stretch, and he walked along the grass so she wouldn't hear him. And what sticks with me are not the details of the crime, but that he made her hold his hand like they were boyfriend and girlfriend. And I can only think that when she was grabbed, she was like 14 houses from home. And as she walked, I could just imagine her going 12, 10, 8. And she got to 6, and he turned down a side street. And the Vicky Collins, who was a postie, and she's driving a little motor scooter just about the end of her shift, and she sees a car with no number plate in Sky Road, and she looks in the rearview mirror, and she notices a big man just slinking down as though he's trying to hide behind the steering wheel. And I thought, if that was me, remember it's before mobile phones, I would have just finished my shift, which wasn't far, and I would have got to the post office, and I would have made a call. She stopped at the first house out of sight, went straight in, knocked on the door and said, "Can I use your phone?" Rang the police. She saw the last victim, Natalie Russell, walk past, and she thought about saying something, but what are you going to say to a 17-year-old girl? There's a car up there. So she didn't say anything. And after Denia killed Natalie, he was coming back to the car and the police were there. So he went home. So after the body's discovered, the police are at their lowest moment. And then they get the running sheets. And they go, let's go and see this guy, because his car, and he just wasn't right. He was too cooperative, and they thought. And the sliding moment, he followed hundreds of women over that period of time. And his first victim was going to be a woman called Donna. And he went to the house, and it was raining. He went to the house, and she had a sixth sense. She had said to her boyfriend, who was a pizza delivery guy, I reckon there's someone following me. Can I take the baby and can we do the run with you? So she wasn't home. And he killed all the cats and in blood wrote, Donna, you're dead. And of course, as you understand, those days without computers, the squad that did that, they went through boyfriends, neighbours. She said, there's a bloke who lives next to my sister, and I walked past him with the baby, and he looked at me in a way that was just not human. What's his name? His name's Paul Denia. And that information never got to the task force.
All right, thanks for that. I think we're out of time. So
I just want to say there's been a lot more laughter than crying.
Yeah, that's right. We might stop on that note. You've certainly given us something to remember. Yeah. John's book will be available for signing now at the bookshop just opposite the cafe down there. Not sure if they've got any of your books.
Our book has just been held up a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
With it's waiting for just a court case or two to finish, which we're hoping will. Okay. That's the trouble of writing a live book.
John's
in the middle
book,
of a
I think,
walk.
is published yesterday.
You can sign a piece of paper and they can stick it in when they go.
You could sign John books too. Anyway, look, can you please join me in thanking Mark Morri, John Silvester. Thanks very much for a great session.